The small group of soldiers moved through the jungle at a slow and measured pace, carefully scanning the ground they passed through for signs of any recent disturbance. Each member of the assault platoon fully understood what was expected of them, both within the small unit itself and also in the context of the wider military campaign. Even before their forces had made landfall at this hellish place several weeks prior, Japanese commanders had carefully evolved the tactics they were now employing. The jungle was so dense, and the pathways through it so poor, that few places existed where a conventional battle between themselves and the defenders could occur. Instead, combat would be joined via a series of localized engagements between individual units, seeking to rout or outflank those they were facing. It was the job of this detachment, as with many others, to track and locate their opposite numbers, engaging them in a violent and very noisy frontal assault, liberally deploying grenades and signal flares during the attack in order to direct reinforcements to their position, who would then go on to crush the opposition they had unearthed. The Australian troops they faced had doggedly resisted them every inch of the way, but sadly, bravery alone had not proven enough to stem their advance. A combination of poor training and substandard equipment forcing the defenders to retire from each and every Japanese engagement, ever closer to Port Moresby. Silently acknowledging the hand signal that had been given off to their right-hand side by Goto, Corporal Nakano waved for the rest of the picket line to come to a halt. Then as each of the men crouched down, training their weapons into the stifling jungle that surrounded them, he cautiously made his way across the line to where Goto waited. Barely able to suppress his excitement, the young rifleman pointed to a black object that was lying discarded on the forest floor a short distance away. The pair slowly made their way across to it, Goto remaining upright to provide cover, whilst his NCO bent down to inspect the item that had been discovered. The object in question was a leather boot, of the same design worn by the Australian soldiers they had previously encountered, but now lying abandoned out on the open forest trail. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Nakano found himself marvelling at the laziness and arrogance of an enemy that he and his companions had been tasked to defeat. Were any of his men to leave such an essential item lying out on the ground, where it could so easily be found, they could expect to be severely punished. Having satisfied himself the solitary item was not part of some wider ambush tactic, the corporal pulled his men back into line, and then they set off again. A short time later, they found themselves halted once more, this time having encountered a rifle and a bayonet, also apparently discarded by its owner. With each subsequent step, the bemused Japanese patrol encountered yet more abandoned items of enemy equipment. A canteen, left uncorked with the contents having long drained away. A map book, containing what appeared to be ambush sites on the paths that lay ahead. An odd set of behaviours, and very different from any that their enemy had displayed in combat against them, in any of the encounters up until this point. With the trail of Australian military equipment having eventually come to an end, Nakano allowed his men a short rest period, with the exception of Chiba and Kasano. He made little secret of his lingering discontent with the two weaker members of their team, who had both performed poorly during their last ambush on the enemy forces. As a result, the pair were again tasked with picket duty, whilst the remainder of the unit rested, a punishment which would persist until they redeemed themselves in his eyes. Settling in to examine the maps they'd acquired, whilst fending off persistent inquiries about the items from Goto, the NCO found himself losing track of time. Eventually clarifying it had been 30 minutes since they'd stopped to recuperate, he directed Goto to stop pestering him and give word they would now be moving out again. But it soon became apparent that something was wrong, when it was discovered that Private Kasano had not returned from his sentry duty. Nakano quietly fumed that none of the rest of the platoon had noticed the disappearance, also angry at himself for having become too distracted by the map book. Splitting into two groups, the assault platoon began to move around the perimeter of their position, searching intently for any trace of the absent sentry. Still cursing whatever stupidity the missing man had succumbed to, Nakano was at the point of calling off the search when a series of gunshots suddenly sounded out. Moments later, having travelled the short distance to where the other half of the platoon had come to rest, Corporal Nakano found himself facing a scene from hell itself. The rest of his men were standing not far from the outer edge of a large pool of oozing and liquid mud, all apparently frozen stiff with fright. Many had swords or pistols to hand, but all were backing slowly away from the nearby mud lagoon, from which a solitary figure was in the act of emerging. Whoever this individual was, they were covered from head to toe in pouring mud, their clothing and personal features completely obscured. As Nakano watched on, the figure moved forwards and steadily, almost as if it were learning to walk for the first time, before then lurching directly towards Chiba, the closest soldier. The hapless private waved his gun towards the shambling menace, screaming for it to retreat, or he'd open fire, but within seconds it was upon him. The figure gripped both of his arms tightly, and as the others watched on in amazement, the mud that covered it began to flow forwards, and up the limbs of the struggling Japanese soldier. With a shrill cry, Chiba fired his pistol again and again, the rounds that perforated the thick layer of ooze covering his assailant, having no visible effect. More mud spread rapidly up and down the entirety of his body, travelling down his groin, his legs, then up over his neck, where it disappeared down into his throat. As he fell retching and coughing to the ground, now as similarly covered in filth as his attacker, Nakano yelled at his men to open fire. A volley of rifle and pistol shots echoed out around the jungle as the figure that stood before the Japanese soldiers was forcefully knocked to the ground by the gunfire. Seconds later, it was back up, on its feet once more, again shambling uncertainly across the ground, towards the nearest waiting soldier. With a roar of guttural rage, Nakano unsheathed his sword, running full pelt towards their enemy, bringing his blade down again and again upon it. Within moments, the foul vision was back down on the ground, one muddy arm having been cleaved completely clear from its torso, the rest of it utterly shredded by his sword blows. Crouching down to examine the severed limb at his feet, Nakano used the edge of his blade to scrape away the thick wet mud, his eyes widening as he did so. Buried beneath the boggy brown outer surface was a perfectly preserved human arm, with a wristwatch and a wedding band still visible on its hand. A dull whimper from behind where he knelt caused the corporal's head to snap up, just in time to see Chiba's muddied remains easing themselves up from the ground. Waving for his men to raise their weapons, Nakano also rose to his feet, ordering the private to remain where he was and to remove the dirt that covered his uniform. His words went unheeded, the mud-covered figure instead swaying unsteadily from side to side, before stumbling directly towards him, its arms up and outstretched. Nakano's blade flashed out several times, just as it had done with his prior attacker, utterly severing Chiba's head from its body. For a time, nobody spoke, the enormity of what had just taken place slowly sinking in, before Nakano moved across to the armless corpse. For several minutes, he used his gloved hands to swipe and grab clumps of mud from its surface, until it revealed the body of a dead soldier, dressed in Australian uniform. As the murmurs of the men standing behind him began to grow, Nakano wrestled with what orders he should now give. Whatever devilry was afoot here clearly required further investigation, but surely that would be better achieved by a larger group of men, after he'd reported it. Movement in the muddy bog several metres away decided the matter for him, as a number of other misshapen forms now became evident and began to rise up from within its depths. Ordering his men to fall back to their original rendezvous point and retrieve their equipment, he resolved for the patrol to make its way back to their own lines, and to report this matter to his superiors, whatever the cost. His arms aching, and his lungs pounding away at his ribcage, Corporal Kato Nakano sank back against the trunk of a tree, his eyes staring glassily ahead of him. His men were all gone, claimed one at a time by lumbering mud-covered forms that had seemingly emerged from every corner of the forest that surrounded them. Whether the corpses that the mud had surrounded and reanimated were those of their fallen comrades, or their allied enemy, did not matter. All that did was that bullets and grenades had done little to fend off their attackers, only the violent use of a sword or entrenching tool proving up to the job. But as his men had tired and fallen away one by one, the numbers of their opponents had gradually swollen, until only he now remained. They were all around him now, still silently and slowly dragging their bodies towards him, arms raised up, ready to claim him and take him amongst their number. Summoning what strength remained within him, the Japanese NCO offered up a silent prayer, then raised his sword to meet the challenge. Hours later, the fallen weapon would be found lying discarded just off the main trail by a patrol of Australian soldiers. The discovery caused them to immediately turn back on themselves and head back towards their own lines, pausing only to retrieve the discarded weapon as a trophy of war before they did so.